For months, the Cleveland Browns tried to keep this quiet. No press conference, no public disagreement, no obvious cracks showing on the surface. But behind closed doors, something shifted, and once it did, there was no putting it back. Bill Musgrave, the coach working closest with Shedeur Sanders, finally stopped playing along with the silence. Not with a rant, not with drama, but with blunt, football-only truth that forced everyone in the building to confront a reality they had been avoiding. This wasn't about hype. It wasn't about protecting a rookie's confidence, and it definitely wasn't about winning headlines. According to people familiar with internal conversations, Musgrave's message was simple and uncomfortable. Sanders was not being handled like a normal rookie quarterback, and that decision wasn't neutral. It was actively slowing his development. That's what made this moment different. When a position coach speaks up, it matters. When a quarterback coach with decades of experience does it, people listen. Especially when the claims are backed by film, practice data, and day-to-day interaction that never makes it to the public. Musgrave wasn't defending potential. He was pointing to patterns. Repetitions gained, efficiency improved. Repetitions taken away, progress stalled, over and over again. And once that door opened, it stayed open. Inside the Cleveland Browns facility, the tone reportedly changed fast. Conversations shifted from "is he ready?" to a far more dangerous question: why hasn't he been given a real chance to be? That distinction matters because one blames the player and the other points straight at the organization. What makes this situation so volatile isn't just Sanders' talent, it's timing. Quarterback development windows don't stay open forever, and franchises that hesitate often realize the cost too late. Musgrave's honesty didn't create controversy, it exposed one that was already there. And once those truths were put on the table, the Browns had a choice to make. Either align everything around developing their quarterback properly, or risk proving, once again, that the problem in Cleveland was never the player. When comments come from a quarterback coach, they carry a different kind of weight. This isn't a media personality chasing attention or an executive protecting an asset. This is the coach who sees every rep, every mistake, and every adjustment up close. That's why when Bill Musgrave changed his tone internally, people inside the Browns organization didn't brush it off, they leaned in. Musgrave has been around too long to speak carelessly. He's coached quarterbacks across multiple eras of the league, seen prospects fail for the right reasons and succeed despite the wrong ones. According to reports from inside the building, his recent messaging wasn't emotional or defensive. It was clinical, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. The core message wasn't that Shedeur Sanders was perfect. It was that Sanders was being evaluated without being properly developed, a distinction that changes everything. What made Musgrave's stance so impactful was how grounded it was in process, not opinion. He wasn't asking for favoritism. He wasn't demanding guarantees. He was pointing out something coaches value more than draft status or reputation: cause and effect. When Sanders received extended reps, his efficiency climbed. When his reps were scaled back, rhythm disappeared. That pattern repeated often enough that ignoring it became irresponsible. Inside the Cleveland Browns facility, this landed harder than outside criticism ever could. It forced uncomfortable reflection. Because if a quarterback struggles after being given inconsistent opportunity, that failure doesn't belong solely to the player. It belongs to the system guiding him. Another reason Musgrave's words mattered is credibility. Quarterback coaches don't usually challenge developmental direction unless the stakes are serious. Sources suggest this wasn't about disagreement, it was about urgency. Jobs, futures, reputations. When development stalls, coaches get blamed just as quickly as players. Silence stops being safe. Perhaps most importantly, Musgrave framed everything as fixable. Sanders' mistakes weren't painted as fatal flaws. They were described as correctable habits, the kind that improve with repetition, trust, and structure. That framing alone reframed the entire conversation. It moved the debate away from, is this player good enough, to, are we doing enough? That shift matters more than it sounds. Because once a respected coach publicly, or even internally, draws that line, organizations are forced to respond. Ignore it, and you risk confirmation that development isn't the priority. Act on it, and you admit something wasn't handled correctly before. Either way, Musgrave's words weren't noise. They were a warning. And inside Cleveland, warnings like that tend to change the direction of everything that follows. What made Bill Musgrave's stance so unsettling inside the building wasn't praise or criticism. It was comparison. According to people familiar with internal discussions, Musgrave repeatedly pointed out that what Shedeur Sanders was experiencing simply didn't line up with how rookie quarterbacks are normally developed in the NFL. This wasn't about coddling. It wasn't about handing someone a job. It was about opportunity. Rookie quarterbacks are expected to struggle. Coaches plan for that. They design development around repetition, rhythm, and trust. But Sanders' situation looked different. His reps weren't building week to week. They were fluctuating. One week extended first-team work. The next scaled back. Progress followed by interruption. Momentum followed by pause. And according to insiders, Musgrave made it clear that this kind of stop-start handling does real damage, especially at quarterback. Quarterback development isn't linear, but it is fragile. Timing with receivers, comfort with protection calls, confidence in throwing windows, all of that comes from consistent exposure. When reps are rationed unpredictably, development doesn't just slow, it fractures. Musgrave reportedly emphasized that Sanders was being evaluated as if he were a finished product, while being developed like an afterthought. That contradiction raised eyebrows. Inside the Cleveland Browns facility, practice participation charts reportedly told a story the public never saw. Every time Sanders received extended work with the starting offense, efficiency jumped. Not slightly, noticeably. Then, without clear explanation, those opportunities would shrink. The cycle repeated often enough that it stopped looking coincidental. Musgrave allegedly asked the question no one wanted to answer out loud. How can you judge a quarterback's readiness when you're limiting the very conditions that create readiness? That question landed hard because it wasn't philosophical, it was practical. Film, data, and daily observation were all pointing in the same direction. What also complicated things was perception. From the outside, reduced reps can look like caution. Internally, they can feel like distrust. And for a young quarterback, that gap matters. Trust fuels aggression. Hesitation fuels mistakes. According to sources, Musgrave believed some of Sanders' inconsistencies were being misread as flaws when they were actually symptoms of inconsistent opportunity. Importantly, this wasn't framed as favoritism. Musgrave wasn't arguing Sanders should play no matter what. He was arguing that evaluation without commitment isn't evaluation at all. It's hesitation disguised as process. And once that idea took hold, it became impossible to ignore. Because if Sanders wasn't receiving normal rookie treatment, then the problem wasn't readiness. It was alignment. And alignment, once questioned, has a way of exposing everything beneath it. Once the conversation shifted from opinions to film, everything changed. According to people familiar with internal reviews, this is where Bill Musgrave became impossible to ignore. The tape didn't support the outside narrative that Shedeur Sanders was raw, overwhelmed, or unprepared. In fact, it showed almost the opposite. What immediately stood out was processing speed. Sanders wasn't late. He wasn't frozen by pressure. Against complex looks, disguised coverages, and simulated blitzes, he was identifying leverage before the snap and confirming it after. That alone separates most rookies from quarterbacks who actually have a chance to develop into long-term starters. Musgrave reportedly emphasized that Sanders was seeing the field like a veteran far earlier than expected. Then came the footwork, a detail casual viewers never notice but coaches obsess over. Sanders' feet weren't frantic. They were purposeful. His plant step matched the timing of his reads. When the first option wasn't there, his base stayed balanced instead of collapsing. That allowed him to transition smoothly through progressions without panic. According to insiders, Musgrave highlighted how Sanders' feet were telling him the answer before the play fully unfolded. One play kept coming up in film sessions, the deep touchdown to Jerry Jeudy. On the surface, it looked like a simple big play. On tape, it was advanced quarterbacking. Sanders read the frontside concept, felt it stall, reset on his second gather step, and immediately came back to the backside dig. No hesitation, no drift, just instinct and trust in his arm. Coaches reportedly described it as the kind of rep most quarterbacks don't master until year 2 or 3. The tape also revealed something else that contradicted outside criticism: decision-making under pressure. Sanders wasn't reckless. He was assertive. He threw receivers open instead of waiting for separation. He took calculated risks rather than defaulting to checkdowns. That led to mistakes at times, but Musgrave reportedly framed those as developmental, not dangerous. Fixable, not foundational. Perhaps most damaging to the old narrative was how consistently Sanders avoided negative plays. Even when protection broke down, he didn't panic into sacks or forced desperation throws. He slid, reset, and lived for the next down. That trait alone is something many quarterbacks never learn. By the end of those film sessions, the internal debate shifted. The question was no longer whether Sanders could play at the NFL level. It became why this level of quarterbacking hadn't been given room to breathe sooner. And once the tape told that story, pretending otherwise stopped being an option. What finally pushed this situation past the point of debate wasn't emotion, opinion, or narrative. It was data. According to people familiar with internal reviews, once Bill Musgrave laid the practice numbers side by side, it became impossible to explain away what was happening with Shedeur Sanders. Inside the Cleveland Browns facility, every rep is tracked: completion percentage in team drills, time to throw, sack avoidance, red zone efficiency, turnover-worthy throw rate. These aren't vibes or impressions, they're measurable trends. And according to insiders, those trends told a story that directly contradicted the public narrative. Every single time Sanders received extended work with the first-team offense, his efficiency spiked. Not marginally, noticeably. Timing improved, decision-making sped up, mistakes decreased. When his reps were reduced, those gains stalled. Not because his skill regressed, but because rhythm disappeared. Quarterback play is built on repetition, and the data reflected exactly that. What reportedly stunned people in the room wasn't just that Sanders' numbers improved with opportunity, it was how consistently the pattern repeated. This wasn't a one-week blip. It wasn't matchup-driven. It was a clear cause and effect relationship. Opportunity led to growth. Reduced opportunity led to stagnation. And yet, the cycle kept repeating. That's when Musgrave allegedly asked the question no one had a clean answer for. How can you evaluate readiness while constantly interrupting development? If reps are the currency of progress, why was the supply being throttled every time progress appeared? The data also revealed something else that complicated things further. Sanders' practice efficiency compared favorably, and in some categories exceeded other quarterbacks on the roster during periods of equal opportunity. That detail mattered because it stripped away the argument that he was simply flashing in isolated moments. The improvement held up under volume. Importantly, this wasn't framed as Sanders being flawless. The numbers still showed mistakes, missed footwork, occasional overaggression, but the key distinction Musgrave reportedly emphasized was trajectory. Sanders' curve was pointing up and it steepened when reps increased. That's exactly what coaches want to see from a young quarterback. Once those charts were put on the table, the tone reportedly shifted fast. Arguments quieted. Resistance softened. The discussion moved away from "is he ready?" to something far more uncomfortable. Why aren't we letting this develop naturally? Because when the data aligns with the tape, excuses disappear. And at that moment, the Browns weren't just evaluating a quarterback anymore. They were evaluating themselves. One of the quietest and most damaging narratives surrounding Shedeur Sanders never had anything to do with arm talent or mechanics. It was the insinuation that leadership might be an issue, that he was too young, too confident, or too different to command an NFL locker room. According to people inside the building, that idea never held up, and Bill Musgrave made sure it was addressed directly. Insiders say Musgrave acknowledged what many players already knew but few coaches were willing to say out loud. Sanders' leadership was not only sufficient, it was already showing up in tangible ways. This wasn't loud, performative leadership. It wasn't speeches or social media optics. It was functional leadership, the kind that shows itself in habits, preparation, and how teammates respond when things go wrong. Receivers stayed late after practice to run extra routes with him. That matters. Veterans don't do that unless they believe the work will translate on Sundays. Offensive linemen communicated more clearly when Sanders was under center, especially with protections and adjustments. That kind of trust doesn't come from draft position. It comes from competence. According to sources, Sanders took responsibility quickly when plays broke down. He didn't deflect. He didn't sulk. He owned mistakes in the huddle and moved on. That ability to reset, especially as a rookie, is something coaches value more than raw production. And it directly contradicts the idea that leadership was ever a concern internally. What's important here is framing. Musgrave didn't portray Sanders as perfect. He didn't claim the locker room revolved around him. He simply made the point that leadership was never the limiting factor. In fact, inconsistent opportunity may have been undercutting the very trust the organization wanted to see. Leadership at quarterback is built through continuity. When teammates don't know who's running the offense week to week, chemistry stalls. When reps fluctuate, confidence does too. According to insiders, Musgrave believed some of the leadership questions being whispered were actually symptoms of instability, not personality. Once that distinction was made, the tone reportedly shifted. Conversations stopped circling around intangibles and started focusing on alignment. If leadership wasn't the problem and the film wasn't the problem, then the issue became impossible to avoid. The problem wasn't whether Sanders could lead. It was whether the organization was willing to let him. Because locker rooms don't rally around potential. They rally around clarity. And once players sensed that Sanders was being trusted, truly trusted, the response followed naturally. Leadership didn't need to be manufactured. It was already there, waiting for consistency to unlock it. There's a moment inside every NFL building when debate quietly dies. Not because everyone suddenly agrees, but because the evidence becomes too heavy to argue against. According to people familiar with those meetings, that moment arrived when Bill Musgrave put the tape on and stopped talking in hypotheticals. This wasn't a motivational session. It was a breakdown, frame by frame, situation by situation, third downs, red zone snaps, pressure looks designed to confuse young quarterbacks. And one by one, the objections disappeared. What the film showed was consistency under stress. Shedeur Sanders wasn't guessing. He was anticipating. On multiple third down plays, he identified leverage before the receiver even came out of the break. That's not instinct you coach in a few weeks. That's processing speed translating into trust in himself and in the system. Musgrave reportedly paused on specific reps where Sanders adjusted protections pre-snap, recognized disguised pressure, and immediately reset hot routes. These weren't safe, scripted looks. These were moments where a quarterback either freezes or takes ownership. Sanders chose the latter, and once those plays were slowed down, rewound, and examined, it became difficult to maintain the idea that he wasn't ready. What mattered just as much was what didn't show up on tape: panic, happy feet, reckless decisions. Those habits plague most rookies when defenses get exotic. Sanders didn't avoid mistakes entirely, but when they happened, they followed a clear pattern: aggressiveness, not confusion. Musgrave reportedly labeled them fixable, the kind that shrink with trust and repetition, not flaws that derail careers. At that point, the tone in the room shifted. The conversation moved away from defending past decisions and toward confronting their impact. Because when the tape confirms the data, and the data confirms the tape, explanations start sounding like excuses. Inside the Cleveland Browns facility, sources say the debate didn't end loudly. It ended quietly. People stopped interrupting. Questions became shorter. The energy changed. No one was asking if Sanders belonged anymore. They were asking why the evaluation process hadn't caught up to what was already on film. That's the most dangerous kind of realization for an organization, because it forces accountability without pointing fingers. It reframes the issue from player readiness to developmental clarity. And once that shift happens, going back to half measures becomes impossible. The arguments didn't stop because Musgrave won them. They stopped because the truth did. Once the argument stopped, the shift inside the building became impossible to miss. According to people familiar with the situation, this wasn't just a quarterback conversation anymore, it was an organizational one. The Browns weren't debating talent, they were confronting alignment. For the first time all season, the tone around Shedeur Sanders reportedly changed from cautious evaluation to intentional direction. Reps no longer felt rationed, they felt earned. That distinction matters more than most fans realize. When players sense that opportunity is tied to performance instead of draft status or politics, the entire culture tightens. Inside the quarterback room, the competitive energy reportedly shifted in a healthy way. Sanders responded almost immediately. According to insiders, he became more vocal in meetings, more assertive at the line of scrimmage, and more demanding of precision from himself and others. Not louder for show, clearer in command. That's usually what happens when a young quarterback finally feels trusted instead of tested. Practice structure began to reflect that trust. Coaches started leaning into Sanders' strengths rather than forcing him into rigid frameworks. Tempo increased. Concepts expanded. Responsibility grew. This wasn't a symbolic change, it was functional. The offense started to feel like it belonged to someone instead of passing through someone. And that ripple didn't stop with the players. Upstairs, decision-makers began asking questions that hadn't been asked as directly before. Why did production spike when opportunity increased? Why did internal grades look different from external narratives? Why had progress been followed by hesitation instead of reinforcement? These weren't accusatory questions, they were corrective ones. According to sources, the phrase developmental mismanagement started circulating internally, not as blame but as a warning. Because mishandling a quarterback doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like inconsistency disguised as caution. And once that idea took hold, it reframed everything. Bill Musgrave reportedly made one point crystal clear: trust is built through opportunity, not speeches. You don't develop confidence by limiting exposure. You don't learn under pressure by avoiding it. Quarterbacks grow when the organization decides to grow with them. That realization marked the pivot. This was no longer about proving critics wrong or justifying draft decisions. It was about credibility, about whether the Cleveland Browns could finally align evaluation, development, and opportunity in the same direction. Because when those elements don't align, progress stalls. But when they do, it doesn't creep forward. It accelerates. And insiders believe that's exactly the phase Cleveland is now entering, whether they fully understand the weight of that moment or not. What started as a quarterback room conversation didn't stay there for long. Once Bill Musgrave's evaluations became impossible to dismiss, the ripple effect reached the area of the building that matters most, the front office. And according to people familiar with internal discussions, that's where the pressure truly began to mount. Executives weren't reacting to noise from the outside. They were reacting to a growing disconnect between what internal data showed and what external narratives suggested. Practice efficiency curves, turnover-worthy throw rates, red zone decision-making, all of it pointed in the same direction whenever Shedeur Sanders received extended opportunity. Performance improved, confidence followed, progress accelerated. Those aren't opinions, they're trends. That raised an uncomfortable question upstairs. If the development indicators are positive, why has opportunity lagged behind evaluation? According to insiders, the analytics department quietly backed Musgrave's stance with objective measurement. Sanders' efficiency metrics didn't just trend upward, they stabilized when reps were consistent. That's a crucial distinction. Flashes can be ignored. Stability can't. Once that information was presented, it reframed the situation from a player debate to a process problem. And process problems fall squarely on leadership. At the same time, another layer entered the conversation, one executives always notice, even if they don't publicly acknowledge it: momentum. When Sanders' name appeared in practice clips or game footage, fan engagement spiked. Social media sentiment shifted. Jersey sales rose. While no serious organization makes football decisions solely on buzz, ownership absolutely tracks when a player moves the needle, especially at quarterback. Inside the Cleveland Browns building, those signals added urgency. Not because of popularity, but because momentum amplifies consequences. Mishandle a quarterback quietly and it fades. Mishandle one while the fan base is leaning in and it explodes. Sources say this is where alignment became non-negotiable. Executives reportedly began pushing for consistency between grading and opportunity. If Sanders was being evaluated as a potential long-term option, then development had to reflect that belief. Half measures no longer made sense. The phrase that kept surfacing internally wasn't blame, it was warning. Developmental mismanagement. Not as an accusation, but as a reminder of what happens when organizations hesitate at the wrong moment. Quarterback windows close fast. Confidence is fragile. And reputations, both player and franchise, are built on how these moments are handled. By the end of these discussions, insiders say the tone upstairs shifted from debate to accountability. Not panic, direction. Because at this stage, the front office isn't just evaluating Shedeur Sanders. They're being evaluated themselves. This is the point where everything converges. Not just a quarterback evaluation, not just a coaching adjustment, but a moment that will quietly decide whether the Cleveland Browns are capable of breaking a pattern that has defined them for decades. At the center of it all is Shedeur Sanders, a rookie who entered the league surrounded by noise, questions, and assumptions, and is now forcing the organization to look inward. Not because he's been flawless, not because he's been protected, but because every measurable indicator says the same thing. When opportunity increases, so does his growth. That's the uncomfortable truth. Thanks to Bill Musgrave's honesty, the Browns can no longer hide behind ambiguity. The tape has been reviewed. The data has been compared. The locker room response has been observed. This is no longer a debate about readiness or potential. It's a test of organizational resolve. For years, Cleveland has searched for answers at quarterback by resetting, restarting, and rebranding the process. New names, new systems, new timelines, and every time the same result followed: impatience disguised as evaluation, hesitation framed as caution. Development stalled before it ever had room to breathe. Now, that cycle is staring them in the face again. If the Browns fully commit, truly commit to developing Sanders, it means aligning every level of the organization behind one direction. It means accepting mistakes as part of growth instead of proof of failure. It means resisting the urge to flinch when things get uncomfortable. That path isn't safe, but it's honest. If they hesitate, the consequences won't show up immediately. They never do. They show up later when progress plateaus, confidence fades and the same questions resurface under a different name. Inside the Cleveland Browns building, people reportedly understand the stakes. Coaches know that mishandling this again could cost jobs. Executives know that another developmental misfire would confirm every criticism aimed at the franchise. Players know when belief is real and when it's conditional. This isn't about proving critics wrong. It's about proving the process works. Because quarterback development doesn't happen gradually. When alignment finally clicks, it accelerates. Trust compounds, growth jumps, and those moments are rare. The Browns are standing in one right now. What happens next won't just define Shedeur Sanders' trajectory. It will define whether Cleveland has finally learned how to stop getting in its own way, or whether this moment becomes just another "what if" in a history full of them.